Sunderland Minster before he came here to be Archdeacon of Maidstone. And they were saying whether it's promotion or a demotion, became the Diocesan Secretary here in the Canterbury Diocese. He's well known for, throughout the diocese, for the ways in which he models in his own life sustainable living and inspires a number of people to actually follow that path themselves. So he's going to be speaking on, I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is. And our other speaker is Professor David Ormrod, the Emeritus Professor of Economic and History. Actually, it says on here, but actually in reality, it's slightly more interesting than that. It's a Professor of Economic and Cultural History. And it's a unique position within the UK. Just thinking some of what David was saying about that playfulness of bringing different areas together. David refounded the Parliamentary Christian Socialist Group back in 1985 with Lord Smith, and at their first meeting they discussed faith in the city, and he was a Labour councillor here in Canterbury in the 1980s. He's going to be speaking for us on social injustice, uneven development, and the degradation of nature locally and globally. So our two speakers are going to give their papers, and then we'll have questions to them both afterwards. Stephen.
Thank you. I think I'll probably stand, then I can see you, and if that puts me off, I might sit down again. But, thank you very much for your introduction and for your welcome. And I've chosen that quote from Greta Thunberg, where she contradicts our previous speaker, who not quite contradicts, but says, "I don't want your hope, I want your action." And that's, I'll explore with that in a moment. But just some of the linkages that came out from a couple of questions about the engagement of clergy with the secular sort of groupings within where we were. The post of Provost of Sunderland Minster was created when Sunderland, or shortly after Sunderland became a city. And it was the city leaders that wrote to the bishop saying, can the church do something in response to this? And the church didn't know what to do. And it was their pestering of the church to respond in some way that ultimately led to the creation of Sunderland Minster and the creation of a post of provost, the abolition of its parochial boundaries, and the inclusion of the city for the Minster to have its influence. In time, not by automatic entitlements, I became, as David was, lost sight of David, is gone. I became chair of the local strategic partnership, which was a grouping that brought the public, the private and the not-for-profit sector together for the common good of the city. And I chaired that for nearly 10 years, and it was an extraordinary influence. As I look back, it was really influential. At the time, it just felt like a part of what my calling was. And we had, the government were giving targets to these, as they do probably, to these groupings to evaluate what needed to be done in education, lower but higher education and state education and health. And one of the targets, just to illustrate that, was to reduce the alcohol-related hospital admissions by a certain amount. And how might we do this? And so really creatively, we got some money from the hospital to pay the two biggest clubs in the town for them to have good quality plastic glasses instead of glasses and bottles. And almost overnight, the admission rate and the accident rate from these fights that involved glass dropped measurably. The saving was enormous. And that was just something that the playful conversation, just letting our imaginations run riot. What can be done for the common good of the city? There were many others. I wrote a column 400 words a week, every week for 10 years. Was a joy sometimes, and other times a labour of love. But that just helped. Part of that dialogue then helped the city to engage with its past. And so we had a competition. Who should be the patron saint of the new city of Sunderland was something that I enjoyed doing, whether it should be Biscop, who won in the end, or whether it should be one of the other saints associated with the monastic community there that essentially founded the city. And there was competitions in the paper, there was all sorts of things that went on, and public debate in the council chamber, and I was a part of the induction for all newly elected councillors into their role, which was fabulous. And at the time, as I say, looking back, and particularly with David's comments, I realised that's probably an age gone by, and sadly, the church have rowed back from that role that the church had in the city at the time. Church's decision, and I'm still in touch with a number of the former chief exec and others about those days, which are very good ones. None of that. All of that's by way of introduction. So does my staff start?
I'm afraid not.
Oh, okay. So let me read you this quote, and I'll return to it at the end, because I'm disturbed by this quote, and I have spent a little bit of time trying to reflect on it, whether I'm guilty as charged by Greta Thunberg, or whether I'm waving the flag behind the march that she's leading. So in her address at Davos, which this particular occasion was in 2019, she reappeared at Davos earlier this year. But the conclusion of a very well-honed speech, she said this: "We are at a time in history where everyone with any insight of the climate crisis that threatens our civilization and the entire biosphere must speak out in clear language, no matter how uncomfortable and unprofitable that might be. We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. Adults keep saying," she was 16 when she said this, "adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Fantastic, fantastic. I hope that when people look back, this will be one of the speeches that deserves greater sort of awareness, and it does tune in, doesn't it, for me anyway, with many of the prophets, many of the 8th century prophets that were saying, talking about justice, about the unjust structures that were there at the time, including and more relevantly the religious structures, and what they should be and what they weren't, and calling it out. And someone at a conference just a week or so ago was saying, was not this what Mary was doing when she was heralding a new era of the proud being brought low and the low being elevated, a reordering, a reversal of the things that were and could be? Was not Mary about the same age as Greta Thunberg? And there's something about the wisdom of, or the power, or the unrefined passion that people speak about justice that sometimes we need to hear and respond to. And so I've been rightly disturbed by Greta Thunberg in trying to work out what my influence might be and how that might work out. So I have sat on something called the Church of England's Environmental Working Group. I think until December I'm theoretically still on it, but I've done my years, and they've been overseeing the response of carbon net zero for 2030, which the Church of England have adopted, and how that might be encouraged, accelerated, funded, and so on. So we've got from the Church Commissioners 190 million between now and the end of 2030 to work out how we might do that, and there's a programme in place to deliver that. It's going to make a very small difference, frankly, that amount. It's about a tenth of what really will be needed to do the work that the Church needs, and that's not including all the Church of England schools, who are the biggest emitters in our diocese. And the cathedral contributes 5%, I think, to our carbon footprint in the diocese. So there are. So I've been on that group, and then I also chair something called the European Christian Environmental Network, which is a sort of European equivalent of connecting lots of different churches and denominations and academics together to try to help people think, to help people shape their policies and practices, so that in Hungary, for example, and to a lesser degree in Romania, the government there are selling off tranches of forests for cash. So quick win cash, but acres and acres, hundreds of acres of forests, old forests, are disappearing. The Church's response is to buy forests to stop them being cleared, and it's partly through the support of a number of other European institutions that have given them courage, that the Church and the government aren't kind of speaking to each other at the moment because of this interruption that the Church is putting in the way of their increasing their cash policies. So that's another kind of way in which I'm working out, asking myself the question, is it enough? Are we doing enough? How can we do more? Because there are so many pressures on all of our time, and yet this is the biggest one, and it isn't kind of gaining much traction. When I came down to this diocese from being in Sunderland, one of the things that I oversaw, as Will is now, I was attached to the newly created Communities and Partnership grouping within the diocese, which looks at the social justice network, and the environment was a part of that. And I thought, well, how are we going to tackle this? And I thought about having some dashboards of the way in which churches could measure the different aspects of their influence in getting hold of their carbon footprint and lowering it. And at the same time, Russia were having the same discussions, and someone called Ruth Knight introduced me to Ruth Valeria, who some of you know, spoke at the cathedral, and she was working for Russia at the time on a similar sort of dashboard. So Ruth Knight put us in the same room together for a couple of meetings, and they took that forward, and that's now something called Eco-Church. And so it just seemed to be a complete no-brainer to do an audit of your activities in a church, whether it's the land you own or the building that you occupy, whether it's the heating, lighting, or whether it's the liturgies that you use, whether it's the communities that you influence, lots of different ways in which you could be mindful of the things that you do. Well, it was like drawing teeth, trying to get churches to engage with this. I just couldn't, and after banging my head against giving the same talk, to deanery after deanery, time after time, Jonathan's done exactly the same, and notice grindingly slow incremental adaptation of this. That's the starting point, let alone what might be. And I think nationally, it's not just true of our diocese, although we are one of the slower ones, but across the church, where we've got, I don't know, 16,000 churches, something like that, we've now got 4,300 churches on Eco-Church. 25%, we've been going at it for 10 years. And you think, what's going wrong? And this, along with Greta's comment, I'm thinking, I was not giving up, but I was thinking, this isn't the right, I'm not connecting. The facts aren't communicating the problem. And And lots of these talks, I like facts, I like the graphs, I like the, the trajectories, I like the understanding of what's going on. Might turn me on, but frankly, it's not turning a lot of people on. It's not making that connection. So what is it that's missing? What is it in my dialogue that's not making those connections? How is this enormous injustice and massive differentials? We're sitting in the British Isles, which are least affected by climate change. We've had some hot days, we've had some rain, but my goodness me, there are people homeless. There are hundreds of thousands of people not able to live where they have always lived, or their predecessors have lived for thousands of years. It's now desert, or it's underwater, and they're now they're becoming some of our refugees. Not ours necessarily, but in different parts of the world, these are new refugees. And if the trajectory of our inability to stick to 1.5 degrees, that was the Paris Agreement years ago, global warming, I think most people are agreeing that our rate of lifestyle or our style of living is going to project that probably to 2 degrees. And unless we really take some serious action, it's going to be well beyond that. If it gets to 2.7 degrees above, 3 billion people on the planet will not be able to live sustainably anymore at all. Those are facts. They really move me, but the facts aren't moving anybody else. I think it was David Hume, a philosopher, who said, just because you have got a pain doesn't mean that I should do anything about it. So the fact that there is our fellow human beings, our fellow Christians in different parts of the world suffering, and the bishops have written to us and communicated about the impact, particularly in South Africa and the lack of water and so on, that's going on there, just because that's communicated to us isn't resulting in any significant action by the West, by those who are least influenced. Catherine Hayhoe, who is an evangelical in America and what's her title? She's a scientist that looks at these statistics and is a significant speaker and contributor to this debate. She similarly has found the frustration with the American right, who are largely in denial about human activity has got anything to do with it. And the latest statement from the right is, well, it's the British Columbia has been significantly on flames across the summer, as well as lots of other parts of the world. And they're saying, well, it's all these forest fires, and that's causing global warming. So what can we do about that? So it is really hard when people come up with this different opinion about what's causing global warming. And she's managed to find some sort of common grounds. And she's written a book recently which is addressing how you talk to people that are very different to what any of us or any other people might say. And she's worked out this, and the conversation was captured in a periodical called The Plough, the current edition of The Plough, which is a collection of essays. She writes in that extracts from her new book, and the word efficiencies are one that's helpful for governments and others to be able to adopt. And I was in a group at something called a roadshow, which we're having in the diocese, where we were having conversations about moving to climate net zero and how churches might adopt eco-church and sign up to it, banging head against more of medieval walls. But the thing that persuaded it there was when one person said, we fitted LED lights and replaced all of our tungsten. It's now 10% of our bills from what they used to be. Suddenly people were interested. This is going to save us money. And I know when somebody is from Faversham, when St Catherine's next Faversham, this was before the fuel hikes, moved from oil to electric, they saved money and people in that church were warm for the first time in hundreds of years. So that kind of self-interest moves people more. And Catherine Hayhoe says kind of, well, if we get there in the end, the medium in which we communicate is kind of a secondary medium. So let's work on what people might be open to hearing rather than some good idea like eco-church. You're looking at me.
3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes left. I have hardly said any of it. So my reflection on Greta Thunberg's "I don't want your hope" takes me back to St. Augustine, not St. Augustine of Canterbury, sadly, but St. Augustine of Hippo, when he said another famous quote of which we'd be aware, that hope has 2 beautiful daughters, courage and anger. And I think if courage and anger can persuade Greta Thunberg that that's what hope is about, I think she'd buy into that. Because I think each of us need to have the courage to just keep on saying what we've been saying. All of us individually have a responsibility for the lifestyle choices. There's plenty of things that help us to make those. But within the communities that we influence, we need to be that prophetic irritant that talks about the bigger picture, that talks about the climate injustice, and is angry enough to make our voice heard, but not too angry to make it to have the door closed on us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your passion.
Okay.
So we move to you, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm going to stay seated actually because I've got a lot to say in 20 minutes and I want to stick to my text if I can. You've got a PowerPoint here. Can you all see that? The lighting in here is slightly... Well, wait a minute. The lighting is not as good as it might be, but if that isn't very clear, there are some handouts. There aren't enough handouts for everybody. But there are 20 or so handouts of these slides. Do you want to? I mean, you just stick with that.
Could somebody flick the light switches at the back? We probably don't need electric lighting in here whilst we talk about the environment.
It's a different thing. You have to. I'll just give a couple at the end.
Donald side did, and that's all I'm doing.
Thanks, Rob. No, I can't like it.
This is not the same as what's on the screen.
It is the same. Well, it's not exactly the
But
same.
it doesn't look
It's not exactly the same. Okay, I'm going to start because we are working to a tight schedule. And obviously we are indeed living through an unprecedented historic discontinuity as the double impact of global economic crisis and environmental catastrophe exercise their effects. It seems that we've crossed a dangerous threshold in human and indeed in planetary history as we venture into the Anthropocene, which is an entirely new geological epoch. If we could have the first slide, Alan, which is not on the handout because it's a photograph. At the last Lambeth Conference, Archbishop Justin outlined the unprecedented challenges facing the Church and the world. A crisis in economic life and food supplies, financial disorder in the West, war in Europe and hundreds of other conflicts, the effects of climate change, a global pandemic, and a crisis of culture and belief. This is a quote from Justin's opening keynote lecture. And I have to say that, if anything, this underestimates the scale of crisis, because alongside all of this, we also have to consider pollution, and we have to consider biodiversity loss as part of the larger environmental crisis, alongside and contributing to climate change. We come to this slide because 3 days later, I think it was on the Wednesday of the Lambeth Conference, which I attended, there was a very lively fringe meeting organised, as you can see on the side of that slide, by various groups, particularly Christian Aid. And we discussed at this fringe meeting these colossal problems. And the bishops agreed. I stood up and made a bit of a speech, and I asked the bishops whether or not they thought all of these problems just mentioned by the Archbishop were connected and interconnected. And the bishops, mostly, many of them from Africa and the southern cone of Latin America, were unanimous. Yes, of course they're connected. Of course they're connected. They're part of a single problem, which there's a sense in which, the Church is especially qualified with 2,000 years of history to reflect on, and more, the ancient world as well. We can get this into perspective. So the bishops, of course they're connected. And this arises from our failure to share the world's resources. And Olivia Graham, sitting next to me, I'm in the funny hat, and Olivia, Bishop of Reading, is sitting next to me. Olivia said, look, you've gone on for 5 minutes, the speech. Put it in one word. Can you please sort of tell us in one line what you're saying, to underline what the bishops are suggesting? Because I also said, rather rudely, we've had a ton of theology, but we need more social science. So as I said, in one word, it really is uneven development across the planet. Uneven development, if you want one sentence. Now, we're talking about uneven development within and between countries, and this has clearly now reached a stage where human exploitation of nature has reached a tipping point. Looking at the recent economic literature, we notice a big difference between those people who see the present conjuncture as a series of fairly short-term disasters, particularly going back to 2008 and the financial crisis, or at most the crisis of the early 1970s, overshadowed by something that we don't fully understand called a climate emergency, where we're all, in a sense, either panicking or being a bit more measured and doing some of the things that Stephen is suggesting. So there's that rather short-termist view of things. And this comes out, I think, in the discussions at Davos, the World Economic Forum, this year, actually. Also, the World Bank, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and of course corporations. All these sorts of people and institutions are saying, look, we're going to put things back on track and build back better. I don't know what you think about build back better. I kind of think when the WTO is saying that, they mean it's just going to be the same again, but, back on track to a slight degree. Indeed, my friend Adam Tooze, financial historians like Adam Tooze, indeed, who was at Davos, speaks of what he calls a polycrisis arising from particularly market instability and a multiplicity of relatively new risks. Adam tends to think of them as financial risks, but it's much bigger than that, although they are indeed intimately connected. Now, secondly, there's another group of people who see the unfolding events as the culmination of processes set in train at least 4 centuries ago. And this is why I say I think the Church is particularly well placed to take the very long view, which is what we have to do, what we should do. So, for example, when we look at the discussions initiated by the World Council of Churches decades ago, Kairos Europa, and its principal spokesman, Ulrich Ducrot. Maybe some of you have met Ulrich at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Did I encounter him there? And several CIR publications, the Catholic Institute for International Relations, which is now sort of, it's now, has it gone into receivership? I mean, it used to be called, changed its name to Progressio, and sadly they went out of business, but they're wonderful publications. So all these church bodies have been pretty much saying, we've got to take the long view. They've been coming up with the solutions which we've not really been listening to properly. And I'm afraid the academic world has been tending, my profession in economic history, has been a bit short-termist. Though not all of us. I happen to be an early modernist. I did the late medieval and early modern period up to 1800, and I used to be paid to take a very long view of the history of these changes. And indeed, my hero, R.H. Tawney, looked at the history of capitalism in the 1920s and 30s, and indeed persuaded us to take the long view. Now, how much longer do I have?
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Well, we're going to do it in 7 minutes. We'll try and do it in 7 minutes. The global and the local, of course, are inseparable. The global can only be experienced locally in time and place. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain played a key role in shaping the course of globalization as a hegemonic imperial power and the first fully industrialized state. Today, Britain's place in the world is, to be perfectly realistic about it, comparatively local. We are now at the periphery of continental Europe. So the history and experience of the UK at the moment is the history of the local, if we can get our heads around that. Now the chronology, Alan, if we could have the next slide please, the chronology of these developments look like this. And I'm glad I've given you this slide which concentrates 2 lecture courses of mine into one slide. First of all, as you can see, this is a timeline, the early modern origins of globalization initiated by Europe, transoceanic expansion and empire building from the mid-16th century, coinciding, of course, with the Reformation. The political and philosophical climate in England after 1660, of course, when Anglicanism stabilized, I'm looking at Kenneth here, when Anglicanism stabilized, had become one of possessive individualism. Thankfully, the Church has at last begun to recognize its earlier role in supporting an imperial system based on coercion, forced labor, and slavery. And here, I want to emphasize the character of the 17th and 18th century Atlantic as an extractive economy, of the plantation economy as an extractive system, which involved the degradation of nature and a cruel assault on the freedom of millions of Africans. The staple crops of sugar, tobacco, and cotton gave rise to monocultures destined for export markets in Europe at the expense of balanced patterns of husbandry and local food needs. So unequal exchange was the basis of that system. So secondly, we come to the first global age, 1850 to 1914, under an enforced Pax Britannica and underpinned by free trade and the ideology of classical liberalism. It's Spain's earlier extraction of silver from the Americas, which enabled Britain to pay for its trade with the Far East and ultimately to reshape and indeed retard the course of 19th century Indian and Chinese development, based again on equal exchange. This was the humiliation of China from the Opium Wars onwards. Thirdly, we come to the next period, war, depression and regulation, 1914 to 1973, with deglobalization during the 1930s. These are the years when Britain's global empire was dismantled and replaced by the already existing Commonwealth, which was founded in 1926. After Indian independence in 1947, the Labour government envisaged the Commonwealth as Britain's key trading partner with welfare reforms at home. But this plan began to falter in the late 1960s, and the European idea, then the EEC, gained traction with joint Labour-Tory support. So finally, we come to the fourth stage, if you like, the second globalization, coupled with deregulation and financialization from the 1970s onwards. The phrase financialization, I should just briefly elucidate. Financialization means the dominance of financial markets and incentives over everything else, including production. So these were the principal elements of neoliberalism in the UK and elsewhere. I want to be clear about this. Someone mentioned liberalism. I don't know what that means anymore. We had classical liberalism in the 19th century, free trade and political economy, and now, since 1973 or 4 or thereabouts, we have neoliberalism in the UK and indeed globally, and there's an authoritarian version of it. It wasn't quite authoritarian when Thatcher started it, but it was pretty ropey, and it's become worse. And this is a kind of market fundamentalism which harks back to the supposedly golden years of the 19th century. Other hallmarks were and are the expansion of private capital at the expense of public assets, a shrinking role of the state, low taxation and Euroscepticism. And the next Labour government will have to repair the damage caused by this failed experiment. I'm glad to say they're going to do it. I've been spending, this time last week, I was on the train to Liverpool with 20 people, councillors and delegates from Canterbury, and we had 5 days of discussion. I'm pretty sure that we're going to start to repair the damage. Now, I've given you here, and I've probably got 3 minutes of that.
A bit longer.
3 minutes, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, thank you. We move to the next slide, please, Alan. I've given you a timeline here, which is the only way I could do it in the time available. But of course, history doesn't follow a linear or even a progressive path. Globalization, in fact, this is terribly important that we grasp this now in light of the environmental crisis. Globalization has in fact tracked long cycles in economic and material life related to the rhythms of the natural world. I think the insights of the great world religions rooted in the harmony of creation attest to this. Judeo-Christianity has sometimes assumed a rather linear pattern, but it's not like that, is it? Buddhism is much clearer. The Eastern religions are much better at noting and realizing, understanding the cyclical nature of how things work. But let's stick to history and social sciences. That's for another day. These are the rhythms of the biosphere that I'm showing you in this slide, and globalization has followed these cyclical movements with increased intensity. We've got 4 great waves. If you can see these grey blocks on the left-hand side, each of these is a great wave of change, a phase of contraction, which economic historians call phase A, periods of expansion, and phase B, periods of contraction. They are waves. If I had a pointer, I could do it better, but you can see the wave here, beginning up here, the A phase of expansion, and the B phase of contraction. And the entire wave we call a logistic. So each of those is a logistic composed of a phase of expansion and a phase of contraction. And here we are, 1974. We can measure these things with data, and you don't need to look at small scale data here. I'm trying to simplify in that diagram. So there is a kind of planetary respiration at work here, a kind of breathing in and out to which all living organisms contribute. Economic historians measure these movements using price and wage series, demographic and climate data. These long waves or these long waves are centuries long, so we call them secular movements. That's a bit confusing for a faith audience, because secular normally means non-religious, but secular, I mean centuries long movements. So these are secular movements, which we see up here. And these movements comprise a rising trend, as I said, phase A, before the decline sets in, phase B. And of course, long-run changes in weather patterns have always existed with demographic and other consequences. But onto the natural cycle of climate change, the natural cycle of climate change, human interventions have now imposed a state of permanent disequilibrium. Many specialists now date this intervention particularly from the years 1945 to 50, which saw the first nuclear explosions and atmospheric pollution. Of course, the enormous rise in air travel and car ownership also contributed during the interwar and post years. Some people, I don't think they're quite right, say, oh, it all started with the British Industrial Revolution. Factory chimneys made no impact. The smoke from factory chimneys made no impact until the 1850s and 60s. It's not, the Industrial Revolution isn't really the proper answer. I mean, if anything, domestic coal burning in London from the late 16th century much more important. It's a gradual thing. I think it's the appalling sin, the evil of Hiroshima, actually. Let's start it. So I come to a stop now. I've got here in my notes, only if time permits, Alan, you could put it on the screen, but I'm going to stop with this, this slide, showing the great divergence, which really is China. At the Labour Party conference, there were two big elephants in the room. One was Brexit. I had a go at them for this. I had a go at Emily Thornberry when she came to Canterbury just before the conference, and we're not going to talk about Brexit. We did have a rally about Brexit in Liverpool. I didn't have time to go because I'm afraid I got stuck with future cabinet ministers. I want to talk about the economy with them, and that's why there's no doubt in my mind that we have some good solutions. So I didn't get to Brexit. The elephant in the room is China, and we never mention China and the Far East. So I leave that slide on screen, and you have a handout which shows you pretty much what is happening with this huge rebalancing of the world system. It began to happen, we call it the Great Divergence in global economic history, at some point between 1820 and 1870, the historic ancient pattern of the dominance of the ancient empires of India and China had by far the largest share of world GDP. The change came about in the 19th century. We disagree in our academic publications precisely, but this is a couple of generations which saw the rise of Western Europe, led by the British hegemon, imperial power, the rise of the USA, and then the world system is now shifting around, obviously moving towards China, India, and the Far East. So I've given you 20 minutes of global economic history, and I hope that helps us get a grip on the other one is the panic.
Fantastic, thank you very much, David.